All right, here we go, starting over. I like starting over. We're going to start over a lot. One of the ideas here is that I've given you the phenomenological method now a couple of times, but in this very simple form. And we're going to keep doing it, keep practicing it, and each time I'll add layers of complexity. So we'll add a little, we'll understand it a little bit better and a little bit more each, as we go along using it. So step 0, draw a circle. In another lecture very soon, we'll talk about 0 and how even this act is already done. Right now, it's just step 0, draw a circle. Step 1, identify your perspectival starting point. Where am I coming from? Where am I coming from? Now let's talk about this a little bit more. Where am I coming from? The reason that this is such an important step is not just for all those reasons I gave you before, right? In order to identify the thing, we need to recognize our perspective, where we're coming from, and then begin to sort of, like target so that we can know where this vantage is and where this vantage is, kind of scientific control, right? In order to control, or what Edmund Husserl calls epoche, sort of blocking out this, bracketing out that, etc.
Epoche is a Greek word that means bracketing. Like you might put something in parentheses or you might put it in square bracket. In other words, bracket out your distractions, bracket out your biases, bracket out your expectations and presuppositions, etc., so that you can see clearly and focus more accurately on whatever phenomenon you're trying to actually really understand. In other words, epoche, it means bracketing.
But there's another really important reason that we need to begin with this, and we will dive much more deeply into this reason as the semester rolls on and as we get more into the material. But one reason is that we need to discover our presuppositions. Part of what this does is helps us to discover our presuppositions. So let's write that down. Discover or uncover. To uncover or discover or reveal our presuppositions, the things that we've supposed before we've even begun, right? So assuming that we know what religion is, right? Assuming that we already have an understanding of this topic that we're going to study before we've even started to study it. So by identifying where we're coming from, what our particular relationship were, just bad experiences with religious people or outstanding experiences with religious people or ecstatic experiences of our own, then all of these things come to play in how we understand what we are doing. But they also help us to discover our presuppositions, our biases, our blind spots, our prejudices. The judgments that we've made a priori, before experience. Our prejudges, our prejudices, the judgments that we have made a priori before we've even begun to investigate. So we're trying to uncover those prejudgments, those prejudices, those presuppositions, and in other words, to kind of identify our blind spots and to do what Socrates called knowing our own ignorance, knowing the limitations of our own knowledge, identifying what we don't know, right? Beginning by identifying as clear as we can what we don't know. This is all the things that I don't know. And let me start there by identifying or discovering or uncovering the suppositions that I have about whatever topic it is. In this case, religion, but the phenomenological method says, let's not presume to know the thing that we're studying before we begin to study it. So how do we do that? Well, that's not easy, and in fact, I think we need to recognize, like the phenomenological method itself, we are constantly uncovering our presuppositions. We are constantly, through the phenomenological analysis, we are discovering more and more the limitations of our own knowledge and experience. That's sort of epistemic humility.
Epistemic humility is just a pretentious way of saying, be humble, and remember how much you don't know. Or, as Kendrick Lamar puts it,
That sort of epistemic humility is built into the method itself. It's what guides the method, it's what grounds the method logically and philosophically. Again, I don't expect you to remember or understand all the things I'm saying right now, but we are going to come back over these things later. Now, there's one important point that I want to add in here, sort of building on what we've already done, but taking it one step further. And thinking back, like I said, to Socrates, Socrates is a person I will bring up quite frequently.
Particularly during the theory and method, the sort of background portion that we're in now, but probably I just bring up Socrates a lot.
Socrates is a character in Plato's dialogues. We don't need to get into who Socrates is. Smart dude. One of the things that Socrates said is that desire often overpowers our logical impulses. In other words, the things that we want, oftentimes we do the things that we want to do rather than the things that we know we should do. Like, I know that I should eat broccoli, right? I should eat broccoli. We should all eat broccoli. Broccoli is good for you. You should eat broccoli. But my desire is for pizza, which is why I would rather eat, 3-day-old cold pizza out of the fridge than a fresh piece of broccoli. Although, actually, that sounds kind of good right now. Nevertheless, so our desires overpower our logical decision making. Socrates says, since we understand that, it's important for us to question our own desires, question our own motivations for engaging in a phenomenological analysis or a philosophical discussion or any kind of study, right? Anytime we're studying it, we need to think about and investigate, why am I doing this? What is my desire? And is my desire, you might say, clouding my judgment, right? Am I trying to just get through this in order to get an A or something like that? Then that is going to cloud or impede your ability to do the task itself, right? So Socrates says we need to begin by questioning our desires around our motivations and never stop doing so. Constantly question, am I doing this because it's the logical and right thing to do? Am I making this decision because it's the most rational one to make? Or am I somehow influenced by my desire to finish, right? To be done with it and go play Fortnite, or my desire to, whatever it is. In other words, it's critically important that we begin by questioning our own motivation. Once we begin to listen to experts, we must also continue in that vein of questioning, what is this person's desire? What is this person's motivation? What are they trying to do? Are they publishing this book because they're trying to get tenure? Are they publishing this book because, they're whatever, right? We need to question people's motivations for doing what they're doing. That doesn't necessarily mean, right? It's just helpful to know. One quick aside, one quick example. When you watch a program, whether it's on YouTube, broadcast TV, Netflix, Hulu, or whatever it is, when you're watching a program, it's good to question, what are those motivations? What is motivating the creator, the content creator? In many cases, their motivation is, to make a profit, to make money, to generate views in order to make money. And the best way to make money is not just by generating views, but also by getting sponsored. Those sponsors have certain motivations, certain demands or requirements. That's what they're paying for. That doesn't mean that the content is necessarily bad if it's sponsored, but nevertheless, it means that we need to bring a certain hermeneutics of suspicion. We must bring a certain hermeneutics of suspicion. Again, for example, I noticed that a particular news-ish program, all of their sponsorships, 100% of their sponsors, like all the commercials that were being shown during the program, all of them were for gold. So they were selling gold as a stable investment. Invest in gold, invest in gold. They were even giving free gold, like buy some gold and get some gold free. Crazy. But I used to be in that kind of sales, finance, and commodities. I was a commodities broker for a while. So I get it, right? The people who are selling commodities, the people who are selling gold, they have to create a market. So how do you create a market for gold? Well, one way is by advertising. How do you advertise? Well, you advertise based on fear, right? The reason people buy gold or will pay more for gold is because they think something's going to happen to the underlying currency, or something's going to happen to destabilize this government or society or whatever. So those who have large quantities of gold and want to sell it as much as they can of it at as high a price as they can, they sponsor programs that promote that type of fear, right? So, which exactly was what the Newsish program was doing. So anyway, we need to bring that sort of hermeneutics of suspicion, kind of questioning what are other people's desires and what are their motivations and how might that influence what they're saying. Doesn't mean that what they're saying is wrong. It just means that, we have to be suspicious of where is that person coming from and why are they coming towards me. I think you get the gist, right? So the phenomenological method builds this in and says, well, we need to begin by questioning where I am coming from. What are my motivations? What are my desires? What's driving me to do this and to engage in this? And only then can we begin to uncover our prejudices, our presuppositions that we've made about other humans or about other cultures or about other beliefs. Anyway, whatever it is. It's good for us to uncover our own presuppositions and prejudices and biases and discover that, or as Socrates said, to know our own ignorance, and to know our ignorance in part is to know our desires and what's motivating this investigation. All right. You know what I'm going to say, right? Let's start over. All right, y'all, let's get her done. Finish this thing up. So let's start over. Step 0, draw a circle. Done that. Step 1, identify your perspectival starting point. Done that. Why are we studying religion? Got some pretty good ideas. Now let's start listening to the experts, right? We kind of have some idea of why we're studying religion. What do these experts have to say? Let's listen to the people who make the big bucks. You know, those people who teach rich kids all day, or those kids who are gonna be rich, those people who've written tons of books and that kind of stuff. Let's listen to some of them. All right, let's start by listening to this guy. This guy who wrote this book. It's a pretty big book, right? Well, he didn't write all of it. It's edited by John Hinnells. John Hinnells. So John Hinnells, pretty smart guy. Passed away a couple years ago, but still with us in spirit. So John Hinnells asked this question: why study religion or theology? Why should we study religion or theology? And his answer was quite simple and straightforward, but significant, which is simply that religion is a powerful force in our world. What does he mean by that? Religion is a powerful force in the world. He means that religion activates people. People act, they take actions based on religious beliefs. So religious communities, religious communities tend to be large communities, so they have power, power of the vote, power of lots of kind of power, right? And so religion is a powerful force insofar as religious communities of large groups of people have particular, voting blocks or motivate or power within the world. But also, religion as an ideology, religion as scripture, religion as practices, all of these have a big influence on human persons. And so if we want to understand human persons, right, whether human persons of today, or Hinnells was really a historian. If you're looking at a historical event that happened in the past, it was most likely done by humans, and those humans most likely had some sort of religious faith or conviction, or at least some sort of titular or verbal, a verbal commitment to a particular religious tradition or faith or community. And so if we want to understand their motivations or the reasons for their taking certain actions or certain historical events in the past, we need to understand as best as we can the way that those individuals thought and what drove their, what were they motivated by, what drove their decisions and their actions. So if we understand how religion is a powerful force in humans, and then we begin to understand religion as a powerful force in our world, then we can understand events that happen in the world because they're performed by humans who are, you get the point, right? All right, now before we rush on to the next person, let's listen to a couple of things that this guy Hinnells has to say. So he writes here at the very beginning of his text, Why Study Religions? He says, are the study of theology and religious studies only for religious people? If you're religious, shouldn't you get on and practice your religion rather than study it? If you're studying religions, shouldn't you get on with that, studying them, rather than discussing abstract theories and debates about methods? Sound familiar? The answer to each of these questions is no. Sound familiar? Obviously, many people do wish to study religion if they are religious because they want to know more about their own religion or be able to see their religion in the context of others. Some people find studying religion helps to develop their own spiritual journey, be they Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Zoroastrian, or whatever. Students in most fields object to starting a subject by lectures on theory and method. But it is necessary to be aware of the different disciplinary perspectives used and to be alert of some of the key issues that affect basic presuppositions. Now, basically, Hinnells isn't saying much there that I haven't already said, but saying it, in a more concise, eloquent, more difficult to discern kind of manner. But then he continues, but why study religions if you are not religious and or do not want to become religious? As a professor of the comparative study of religions, the first question meaning Hinnells, not me, I am commonly asked when meeting people is, which religion do you belong to? Those who know me to be an atheist often ask why I spend most of my time studying something I believe to be wrong. Indeed, one might go further. I incline to the view that religions are dangerous because more people have been tortured and killed for religious reasons than for any other motive. Persecution, the torture and killing of heretics, and people of other religions have been major themes running through much of the world history. At a personal level, a religion can be helpful, supportive, and even joyous for many people, but equally many are tortured by feelings of guilt or shame because they cannot live according to the ideals of their religion or cannot in conscience accept doctrines that they are expected to hold. Of course, one doesn't have to agree with something in order to study it. Students of the Holocaust do not have to agree with Hitler and his followers. One can learn something about history about oneself from studying even evil forces. But why have whole departments of theology and religious studies? Why have such financial and human resources been invested in the subject if it is harmful or marginal and for which one has no attachment? One does not have to be ill to become a doctor. But one does have to care for people and want to aid the sick in order to be a doctor. Why study religions if one does not wish to encourage people to be religious? He goes on at some length to answer that question, but I've already given you his answer, which is because religion is a powerful force in the world. For all of those reasons that he listed, it's important to study religions. It's helpful to understand why people do the things that they do. But notice here, the reason that I took the time to read that text to you now, one is that I could assign it, but who reads that? The reason I'm taking time to read that now is because I want to draw attention to the fact that Hinnells is practicing the phenomenological method. He is doing what we were talking about. He is identifying his presuppositions. He's identifying his biases. He's identifying where he's coming from and what motivates his study of religion and theology. So one doesn't have to agree with religion in order to study it. In fact, one might study it because one disagrees with it, and Hinnells is in that camp. But my point is slightly different, which is that it's important, regardless of whether you agree or disagree or like religion or feel it's, or hate it or love your own but hate your neighbors. Regardless, it's important to sort of identify those starting points up front, right? They may not be where we end up because the whole point of studying is to learn things and, Nevertheless, it's important to identify where we are and where we're coming from and what those motivations are, and also to sort of identify the motivations of the people that we are studying. Let's move on. I think you get the point. All right, next on the OG list is this dude named Francis X. Clooney. Professor, Dr. Father Clooney. Father Clooney, just in the interest of full disclosure, as I've already mentioned him before in the very first lecture, but he is my doctor father, the father of my doctorate, my mentor, my guide, the one who got me to where I am. So certainly I agree with him. And his answer to this question, well, he has lots of answers to this question, but I'm just going to give you one of them. He's coming at it from quite a different angle than Hinnells. In fact, I should probably move it down here, but I'm not going to. But yeah, so they're coming at it from quite different angles. So Professor Clooney, Father Clooney, Dr. Clooney, Frank, he says, why should we study theology? Well, in order to be a good neighbor. So as I said, he's a priest, he's a Jesuit priest. And so in order to follow that doctrine that Jesus gave in Luke chapter 10, in order to be a good neighbor, to love one's neighbor as oneself, in order to love one's neighbor as oneself, you need to know something about what your neighbor believes. What are their deeply held beliefs, convictions, ethical motivations? What do they feel? In order to be a good neighbor, you need to know some of the things that your neighbor deeply cares about, right? And so people have deeply held beliefs and convictions, and if we want to be good neighbors to those people, then it's helpful to at least know something about what they believe, right? That's just part of being a good neighbor. It's also part of being a good communicator, etc. In order to be a good neighbor, we need to at least attempt to understand our neighbor's religious traditions and backgrounds and convictions and beliefs and traditions, etc. All right, now let's all right, now let's move along the circle. Another little point here. Probably put this guy much closer to Frank Clooney. John Thatamanil. John Thatamanil, another former student of Professor Clooney's. Very similar, we think in rather similar ways, except John Thatamanil is Protestant, not Catholic. So that's a significant difference. John Thatamanil. So he gives lots of different answers to this question. We could probably spend a whole lecture just giving answers that John Thatamanil has come up to this question: why study other religious traditions, or why study theology? But I'm just going to give you one again, and his is very similar to, this one is very similar to Clooney's. His, though, instead of looking at the New Testament, Luke chapter 10, he's looking back at Exodus chapter 20, verse 16. Exodus chapter 20, verse 16, which says, "Do not bear false witness against your neighbor." Again, there's concern for neighbors among Christian traditions. Do not bear false witness against your neighbor. In other words, in other words, don't say things about your neighbor that aren't true. So, oftentimes I hear students and others say things like, "Oh, well, don't Jews believe this, or Hindus believe that, or Muslims believe this, or Christians believe that," or something. Don't bear false witness against your neighbor, right? Don't say that your neighbor believes something if you haven't talked to your neighbor, right? So to be a good neighbor is to ask your neighbor, what do they believe? Don't make claims about religious others don't make claims about religious others, right? Instead, listen. That's the third step of the phenomenological method. Listen to others. Listen to what other people have to say. Listen to other people as they tell you what their religious beliefs and convictions are. Don't bear false witness against your neighbor. So one of the things that both Clooney and Thatamanil and Hinnells and me and so many others point out is that these days it is just very, very easy to learn about your religious neighbors. Particularly, the easiest way, of course, and the most reliable way is simply to listen to them. But there's no reason then to bear false witness against one's neighbor when it's so very easy to just listen to their neighbors as our neighbors tell us what they, about their beliefs and practices. So again, to be a good neighbor, we need to listen to and learn from our neighbors as an act of love, as an act of kindness, and as an act of hospitality, right? Just to listen and learn from our neighbors about their religious convictions. All right, now, we probably shouldn't read too much into where I place things on the circle, but if we were going to think about where to put this next person, I think we would put them more over here on the Hinnells side of things than on the Clooney-Thatamanil side of things. Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. Professor Spivak is a professor at Columbia University, professor of literature. She's super big deal. She's not a scholar of religion or theology. She's a scholar of literature, as I said. And she hasn't really answered this question as far as I know, why study religion or theology. But she does have some pretty great answers to a different question, a related question, kind of a bigger question, which is why study the humanities? What is the role of the humanities within the university? But also, what is the role of the humanities in the world, in society? Why do we teach the humanities? Why do we devote time and make courses like this a requirement, right? Why do you have any of the humanities courses as requirements? What is the role or function of the humanities within the university, within a human person, within society at large, etc.? Spivak's answer, again, I'm just trying to give you simplified versions of all of these things. Obviously, these scholars have way more complex, sophisticated ideas than what I'm giving you now, but we're just giving a sort of a meta-narrative survey of answers to this question.
A meta-narrative is a story that is made up by scholars for the sake of understanding complex issues in an overly simplified way. They are powerful, useful tools, but only so long as we don't forget that they are stories that we fabricated. We just made these stories up.
Spivak's answer to the question, why study the humanities? She says, in order to promote imagined subjectivity. Imagined subjectivity. We need to study the humanities. It's important to study the humanities. Why study the humanities? in order to promote imagined subjectivity. Now, what does she mean by imagined subjectivity? Well, it's kind of a pretentious, erudite, sophisticated way of saying simply to imagine what it feels like, to stand in somebody else's, another subject's shoes, right? To see things from their vantage, to see things, to imagine what the world looks like from that other perspective, right? From the other side of the fence, right? To see, to imagine being an other subject. Part of the reason that it's important to do this, why? Because then we might just simply ask, well, why do we want to promote imagined subjectivity? And Spivak's point is that this is where empathy begins. This is where ethics begins. Empathy begins with imagining what it feels like. That's literally what empathy is, right? To empathize with someone is to imagine their pathos, what they're feeling. But that's an imaginative act, right? So to imagine what it feels like or imagine what someone else is thinking is an act of imagination, which is precisely what is taught by the humanities, which are stories about humans. And the humanities, therefore, play an important role within the university, within the human person, within society, because they give us the tools, right? The skills. Not just saying it's important to imagine what somebody else is thinking, to be able to imagine what it feels like to stand in somebody else's shoes. Clearly that's important, right? But the question then is how? And Spivak is saying, well, this is what the humanities does. It demonstrates how. It is the practice of how. It is the practice of teaching you about other human persons and how they think in order to imagine what it is like to stand in somebody else's shoes. Later, we're going to come back to that. What is the evolutionary importance of that? What's the evolutionary benefit of that imagined subjectivity, being able to see things from the vantage of another human person?